When Donald Trump first rolled out his sweeping tariff plans, the message was simple and bold: America was losing, and tariffs would make it win again. He told the American people that the United States had been taken advantage of for decades, that other countries were growing rich off unfair trade deals, and that a tough stance, using tariffs as a weapon, would turn the tide. The promise was compelling: new factories, thriving American jobs, and other nations footing the bill for decades of imbalance. But behind the rhetoric, the reality began to unravel quickly. As the trade war escalated, something unexpected happened. Prices started to climb. Consumer goods, from washing machines to electronics, became noticeably more expensive. The very people tariffs were supposed to protect, American consumers and workers, began feeling the squeeze. Economists, trade experts, and business owners sounded the alarm. And yet, the narrative held strong among many of Trump's supporters, at least at first. According to early polls, nearly half of Republican voters believed that the tariffs would boost the U.S. economy, echoing Trump's own claims that other countries would be the ones paying the price. But data began to tell a different story. Reports from the Federal Reserve and the Congressional Budget Office began to show that the costs were not being absorbed overseas, they were being passed directly onto American consumers. The average U.S. household was reportedly paying over $5,000 more per year due to increased prices caused by tariffs. Job growth in key manufacturing sectors stalled. In some cases, entire factories shut down or moved production offshore to avoid retaliatory duties or rising input costs. And in agriculture, once a backbone of Trump's support base, farmers faced devastating losses as China and other countries struck back with retaliatory tariffs of their own. This triggered a shift in the public narrative. While some supporters continued to defend the policy, their rationale began to change. No longer was it about immediate wins. Instead, it became about long-term sacrifice. The pain, they argued, was necessary. The economy would eventually rebound, they said. Manufacturing jobs would return, the trade deficit would shrink, and the US would be stronger for it. But as the months turned into years, that promised rebound failed to materialize in any meaningful way. In this video, we're going beyond the headlines. We'll break down exactly what happened when Trump's tariffs hit the US economy. We'll follow the money, track the consequences, and separate the slogans from the statistics. From price increases to job losses, from political narratives to cold hard data, we're diving deep into the real impact of tariffs on the American economy. Whether you support Trump's trade policy or question it, this story is more than just politics. It's about your wallet, your job, and the future of US economic policy. Let's uncover the facts. Tariffs 101. What are they really? To understand how Trump's tariffs impacted the US economy, we first need to understand what tariffs actually are. A tariff is essentially a tax on imported goods. When a country imposes a tariff, it adds a financial cost to products that are brought in from other nations. The idea behind this is straightforward. make foreign goods more expensive so that consumers and businesses are more likely to buy domestically made products instead. In theory, this supports local industries, boosts employment, and reduces reliance on foreign supply chains. But in practice, tariffs rarely play out so neatly. The money from tariffs doesn't come from foreign governments or producers. It comes from the importers who bring those goods into the country. And those costs are often passed directly to consumers. When you hear phrases like import taxes or border duties, it sounds like a punishment aimed at foreign competition. But the economic reality is that tariffs act like a hidden sales tax on everyday items Americans rely on. And when applied broadly, they can ripple through the entire supply chain, raising the cost of manufacturing, transportation, and retail. Tariffs are not new to US policy. In fact, they played a major role in early American history. Presidents like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln used tariffs as a way to build domestic industries and protect fledgling businesses from being crushed by more established European economies. For much of the 19th century, tariffs were one of the federal government's main sources of revenue. But over time, especially after World War II, the global economy shifted toward free trade. New economic alliances, treaties, and the rise of institutions like the World Trade Organization encouraged countries to reduce trade barriers, including tariffs, in favor of open markets and global competition. By the time Donald Trump entered office, tariffs had become relatively rare and targeted tools used in specific situations. But Trump flipped the script. He made tariffs a central feature of his economic strategy. His administration imposed sweeping import taxes on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods, targeting not just China but also key allies like the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. Steel, aluminum, electronics, automobiles, and even household products were all affected. Trump's approach was aggressive and broad. He saw tariffs not just as a tool to balance trade, but as leverage in a larger geopolitical strategy. This wasn't about quiet negotiation, it was about forcing other countries to the table by disrupting the status quo. It was economic nationalism at full throttle, wrapped in the language of winning trade wars and restoring American greatness. The centerpiece of this policy was the trade war with China. The Trump administration claimed China was engaging in unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and currency manipulation. Tariffs, according to the White House, would pressure Beijing into making concessions. And while there were indeed long-standing issues in the US-China trade relationship, the way these tariffs were implemented, and the speed and scale at which they were introduced, shocked economists and global markets alike. What followed was not just a shift in pricing. It was a seismic change in how the world viewed American trade policy. Import taxes became political weapons. Economic nationalism replaced international cooperation. And the ripple effects, especially for American consumers and small businesses, were only just beginning to surface. As we continue, we'll explore how these theoretical policies collided with real-world consequences, and why the costs fell hardest on the very people they were supposed to protect. Trump's tariff strategy, what he promised, when Donald Trump took to the campaign trail in 2015, his message was unlike anything Americans had heard in decades. He painted a picture of an America that had been gutted by globalization, hollowed out by bad trade deals, and betrayed by leaders who prioritized international diplomacy over American prosperity. His promise was simple but powerful: to bring back manufacturing jobs, to punish countries that had taken advantage of the US, and to level the playing field using tools that had long been abandoned by mainstream politicians. One of those tools was tariffs. From the very beginning, Trump framed tariffs as a bold economic weapon. He spoke often about how China was robbing the United States blind, how other countries were flooding American markets with cheap goods, and how the only way to stop it was to fight fire with fire. He claimed that previous administrations had allowed the US to become dependent on foreign manufacturing, especially from China, and that his administration would reverse this trend by slapping heavy import taxes on foreign goods. In rally after rally, he promised that this strategy would bring factories back, restore pride to the American workforce, and reduce the trade deficit. Central to this message was the idea that foreign countries would pay the cost. Trump insisted that tariffs wouldn't hurt Americans. Instead, they would force countries like China, Mexico, and those in the European Union to lower their prices, play fair, and start buying more from the United States. He told voters that the days of unfair trade were over and that under his leadership, America would start winning again. It was a direct appeal to the millions of blue-collar workers across the Midwest and the Rust Belt who had seen their communities decline as factories shut down and jobs were outsourced. The slogan, "Make America Great Again," wasn't just about cultural identity. It was a promise of economic revival. Tariffs became a centerpiece of the MAGA agenda. They weren't just taxes, they were symbols of a new direction, a clear break from decades of free trade ideology. Trump used tariffs to demonstrate that he was willing to do what others wouldn't. He would take on China. He would punish cheating. He would protect American workers, even if it meant disrupting global markets. And he did not stop with rhetoric. Once in office, Trump moved fast. His administration imposed tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, arguing that cheap foreign metals were undermining national security and destroying US industry. Domestic producers cheered the move, hoping for relief from years of price competition. But the reaction was swift and global. Allies pushed back. China responded with tariffs of its own. A full-blown trade war began to take shape, and the consequences began to pile up. Trump's tariffs expanded beyond metals. The administration targeted automobiles, solar panels, washing machines, and thousands of consumer goods. Each new tariff was framed as a negotiation tactic, a way to force countries to come to the table and sign better deals. And in some cases, that tactic appeared to work. Canada, Mexico, and the United States renegotiated NAFTA, resulting in the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. The administration also reached a partial deal with China known as Phase 1, in which China agreed to purchase more American agricultural products. But beneath these deals, a larger question remained unanswered. Were these tariffs actually helping American workers and industries in the long term, or were they simply short-term political wins wrapped in patriotic language? Trump's team argued that pain was inevitable. They admitted that there would be short-term disruptions, but insisted the payoff would be worth it. Factories would reopen. Wages would rise. Dependence on foreign suppliers would shrink. And America would finally reclaim its status as an industrial powerhouse. For millions of Americans, especially those in regions that had suffered from manufacturing decline, the message resonated. Trump spoke directly to their frustrations and promised something tangible, not just hope, but results. Tariffs became more than policy. They became a symbol of fighting back against a system that many believed had left them behind. In the eyes of his supporters, Trump wasn't just changing the rules, he was rewriting them. But the power of a promise lies in its delivery. The next part of this story dives into what happened when these bold declarations met economic reality. Did foreign nations absorb the cost, or did American households and businesses end up footing the bill? The answers may surprise you. Because while the headlines focused on political drama, the numbers told a very different story. The reality check: who actually paid the price? When the Trump administration launched its sweeping tariff campaign, the message was loud and clear: America would win, and other countries would foot the bill. But as the trade war escalated, economists began to sound a different alarm. They weren't just theorizing. They were looking at real-time data, and what they saw contradicted the political narrative. Despite the rhetoric, it was not foreign exporters, not Chinese manufacturers, not Mexican suppliers who were absorbing the cost of Trump's tariffs. It was American businesses, American retailers, and ultimately, American consumers who were left holding the bill. The idea that tariffs are paid by foreign governments is a persistent myth. In reality, tariffs function like an invisible tax collected at the border. When an American company imports goods, whether it's electronics, steel, machinery, or clothing, those goods are now subject to an additional fee. That cost doesn't magically disappear. It becomes part of the price the company has to pay to get the product onto American soil. And in order to remain profitable, businesses do what they've always done when faced with higher input costs: they pass those costs along to consumers. The Federal Reserve conducted multiple studies during the height of the trade war and concluded that nearly all of the tariff burden was falling on U.S. firms and households. A detailed analysis by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Princeton University, and Columbia University found that U.S. consumers and companies were paying almost the full cost of the tariffs through increased prices. There was no evidence that Chinese exporters were lowering their prices to absorb the hit. Instead, they continued selling at the same price, while American importers paid the extra fees. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the average American household saw its annual costs rise by approximately $5,200 as a direct result of tariff-driven price increases. That figure includes everything from higher grocery bills to costlier appliances, from construction materials to automotive parts. It was a hidden tax that crept into everyday life, affecting families regardless of political affiliation or income level. One of the clearest examples of unintended consequences came from an unlikely product category: washing machines. In early 2018, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on imported washing machines in an effort to protect domestic manufacturers like Whirlpool. At first glance, it seemed like a win for American industry. But as economists quickly discovered, the price of washing machines surged by nearly 12% within months of the tariffs taking effect. Consumers who had nothing to do with international trade were suddenly paying significantly more for basic household appliances. And it didn't stop there. The price of dryers, products not directly subject to tariffs, also increased. Retailers bundled the cost of both appliances together, knowing that consumers typically purchased them as a pair. The result was a broad, inflationary impact across the appliance sector. Whirlpool, the company the tariffs were meant to protect, did see an initial bump in domestic sales. But it was short-lived. Input costs for steel and other materials also rose due to overlapping tariffs on raw materials. Eventually, the benefits of protectionism were offset by the rising costs of production, leaving manufacturers, retailers, and consumers all caught in the same inflationary trap. The ripple effects extended beyond major appliances. Consumer electronics, a category heavily reliant on Chinese manufacturing, saw noticeable price hikes. Smartphones, laptops, smartwatches, and even televisions faced upward price pressure. Retailers like Walmart and Best Buy openly warned that they would have to increase prices in response to the tariffs. Meanwhile, small businesses that relied on imported parts or finished goods found themselves squeezed by shrinking margins and volatile supply chains. Clothing and footwear industries, which had long relied on overseas production to keep prices affordable, were also impacted. Although some categories were temporarily exempt, the uncertainty surrounding tariff policies caused logistical disruptions and forced brands to either eat the costs or raise prices. For budget-conscious families, this meant more expensive back-to-school shopping seasons and rising costs for basics like shoes, coats, and uniforms. In rural communities, the pain was compounded. Farmers who depended on exports to China and other markets found themselves caught in the crossfire of retaliatory tariffs. Soybean exports plummeted. Pork and dairy producers lost access to critical markets. In response, the Trump administration issued billions of dollars in bailout payments to farmers, attempting to offset the damage. But even those subsidies, while temporarily helpful, didn't undo the long-term market losses or restore the shattered trade relationships that had taken decades to build. The cumulative effect of these policies created a quiet but powerful shift in the American economy. Inflation, already rising for other reasons, was quietly being fueled by the additional costs imposed at the border. For the average consumer, the link between tariffs and their grocery bill wasn't always obvious. But economists saw it clearly. Tariffs were acting as an indirect tax, one that targeted families and small businesses more than multinational corporations or foreign competitors. For all the talk of making other countries pay, the numbers told a different story. Studies from multiple institutions, including Harvard, MIT, and the National Bureau of Economic Research, confirmed that tariff-driven costs were internalized by American consumers, not externalized onto trading partners. And these costs didn't just reflect isolated price hikes, they reverberated through entire supply chains, affecting transportation, packaging, warehousing, and retail operations. The economic impact of tariffs was further amplified by uncertainty. Businesses couldn't plan ahead. Would a product be taxed next month? Would tariffs increase? Would there be another wave of retaliation from China? This instability made it difficult for companies to invest, expand, or hire. The trade war, instead of creating confidence, introduced chaos into sectors that relied on long-term contracts and predictable pricing. While the political message remained firm, tariffs were good for America, the data continued to paint a starkly different picture. Costs were up. Prices were rising. And the burden was falling squarely on the shoulders of American consumers. The trade war wasn't just a geopolitical chess match. It was a direct hit to the wallets of millions of families across the country. As we look deeper into this unfolding story, we begin to see that the damage wasn't just economic, it was structural. And the industries that were supposed to be saved were often the ones that suffered most. In the next section, we'll explore what happened to American jobs in this new tariff economy, and whether the bold promises of manufacturing job losses and manufacturing myths at the heart of Donald Trump's tariff strategy was a promise to revive American manufacturing. He spoke often of shuttered factories, lost steel towns, and the need to bring jobs back from overseas. The vision was powerful. Cities once hollowed out by globalization would be reborn under new trade policies. But as the tariffs took effect and the trade war intensified, the economic reality began to diverge sharply from the political narrative. Rather than restoring manufacturing strength, Trump's tariffs led to widespread job losses across multiple sectors. According to estimates by Moody's Analytics, over 300,000 American jobs were lost due to the trade war and the cascading effects of tariffs. The Peterson Institute for International Economics supported this conclusion, noting that while some industries received temporary boosts, the overall impact on employment was negative. Jobs did not flood back. In fact, the manufacturing sector saw contraction rather than growth. The losses were not confined to factories alone. Tariffs created ripple effects that hit agriculture, retail, logistics, and services. Farmers were among the first and hardest hit. When China imposed retaliatory tariffs on American soybeans, pork, and dairy products, entire farming communities faced devastating economic blows. Export markets that had been stable for decades were suddenly closed off. Prices plummeted, and many farmers were forced to take emergency loans or sell land just to stay afloat. In the retail sector, uncertainty caused by tariff fluctuations made it nearly impossible to manage pricing and inventory. Importers struggled to calculate how much their goods would cost once they reached US shores. Businesses that relied on Chinese goods, even indirectly, saw their expenses rise and their profits fall. Many were left with a choice: pass the cost on to consumers, or absorb the losses and risk closure. For smaller businesses without the cushion of corporate reserves, the outcome was often layoffs or bankruptcy. Services were not immune either. When manufacturing contracts or retail chains cut staff, service jobs that depended on those industries, everything from maintenance and cleaning to catering and logistics, began to vanish. The chain reaction extended far beyond the factory gates. These were not just statistics. These were real jobs, real paychecks, and real families affected by policies that were supposed to help them. One of the clearest contradictions to the tariff narrative came in the form of factory closures that happened during or after the implementation of Trump's policies. While the administration spoke of factories reopening, on-the-ground data showed a different trend. Many companies chose to move operations out of China, but instead of bringing them back to the US, they redirected production to other low-cost nations like Vietnam, India, or Mexico. The manufacturing didn't come home, it simply migrated. Harley-Davidson provided one of the most symbolic examples of this contradiction. The iconic American motorcycle company announced during the trade war that it would be shifting some production overseas in response to retaliatory tariffs from the European Union. These tariffs, imposed as a direct response to Trump's metal tariffs, made it more expensive to sell American-made motorcycles in Europe. Rather than raise prices or lose market share, Harley-Davidson chose to build motorcycles closer to their target customers abroad. The irony was unavoidable. A company that symbolized American industrial pride was moving jobs overseas because of a policy designed to protect American industry. The manufacturing jobs that were supposed to return never materialized at the scale promised. A 2019 report by the Congressional Research Service confirmed that while some plants saw marginal employment increases, these were offset by losses elsewhere. The report found no evidence of broad-based manufacturing revival due to tariffs. Instead, companies cited rising costs, market uncertainty, and retaliatory duties as reasons for cutting jobs or freezing hiring altogether. A study from the National Foundation for American Policy concluded that for every job saved by tariffs, several more were lost in downstream industries. The authors described the tariffs as a form of economic self-sabotage. The steel and aluminum industries, which were supposed to be the big winners, did see some gains. But those gains were often short-term and required government subsidies to remain sustainable. Meanwhile, industries that use steel and aluminum, such as automotive, aerospace, and construction, suffered job cuts as their input costs rose sharply. Perhaps the most sobering analysis came from economist Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics, who summarized the situation with brutal clarity: "We lost more jobs than we saved." It wasn't just a matter of numbers. It was a question of expectations. The administration had promised a resurgence. What happened instead was a fragile and chaotic landscape where companies hesitated to invest, workers faced layoffs, and supply chains unraveled. The labor market was already evolving due to automation, digitization, and changing global dynamics. Tariffs added another layer of disruption, not adaptation. They were not accompanied by large-scale infrastructure investment, retraining programs, or innovation incentives that might have supported a modern manufacturing revival. Instead, the policy relied heavily on the idea that pressure alone, economic force against foreign competitors, would reverse decades of decline. But that decline was not simply the result of unfair trade. It was also the result of complex economic evolution. Global supply chains, cost efficiencies, and technological advancements all played a role in moving production overseas. Addressing that challenge required more than tariffs. It required a comprehensive vision that included education, innovation, and long-term investment in human capital. That vision never arrived. By the end of Trump's term, the manufacturing sector was not significantly stronger. It was more unstable, more expensive, and more uncertain. The promise of jobs flooding back turned out to be more myth than reality. And for many Americans who had hoped for a second chance at economic security, the result was not pride but disappointment. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at how the trade war with China unfolded on the world stage, and how a tit-for-tat escalation between two economic giants created collateral damage that extended far beyond factory floors. The trade war with China, blow by blow. The trade war between the United States and China didn't begin with a single tweet or a press conference. It began with a shift in tone, one that turned into policy, then into escalation, and eventually into a global economic disruption. What started as a campaign promised to hold China accountable quickly evolved into one of the most aggressive trade standoffs in modern history. The blow-by-blow progression of Trump's tariffs against China created waves that touched nearly every industry, disrupted global supply chains, and redrew the map of international trade. It began in early 2018 when the Trump administration announced tariffs on solar panels and washing machines, signaling that it was ready to play hardball on trade. But the real flashpoint came in March of that year, when Trump imposed steep tariffs on imported steel and aluminum under the justification of national security. While these tariffs were aimed broadly, China was seen as the primary target. The administration followed this move with a list of Chinese goods worth $50 billion that would be hit with new import taxes, citing intellectual property theft and unfair trade practices. China wasted no time responding. It imposed its own set of retaliatory tariffs on American goods, including agricultural products like soybeans, pork, and dairy. The message was strategic and clear: China wasn't going to back down, and it was targeting key constituencies in the United States. By aiming directly at US farmers, many of whom had voted for Trump, Beijing sent a calculated warning: this trade war would come with real political consequences. As the year progressed, the tit-for-tat escalated. The Trump administration announced tariffs on $200 billion of additional Chinese imports. China countered with $60 billion in tariffs of its own. American manufacturers, retailers, and agricultural exporters began to feel the pressure. Soybean exports to China, which had been a cornerstone of U.S. agricultural trade, collapsed almost overnight. According to data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, soybean exports to China dropped by nearly 70% in the first year of the trade war, costing American farmers billions in lost revenue. To offset the damage, the Trump administration approved more than $28 billion in emergency subsidies for farmers. These subsidies, while offering short-term relief, did not solve the underlying problem. Markets once lost are not easily regained. China turned to Brazil and other producers for its agricultural needs, forging new relationships that would not easily revert even if tariffs were lifted. The USDA reported that some American farmers, after decades of exporting to China, were forced to shift to less profitable crops or exit farming altogether. The political undertone of China's retaliation became more evident as the trade war continued. Products from states like Iowa, Wisconsin, and Ohio, swing states that were critical to Trump's electoral base, were hit with particularly harsh tariffs. It was a geopolitical chess move designed to create economic discomfort in politically strategic regions of the United States. And it worked. While some farmers and manufacturers remained loyal to Trump's vision of long-term gain, others expressed growing frustration as losses mounted and uncertainty deepened. Behind the scenes, the global economic order was shifting. According to analysis from the Brookings Institution, the United States, once the anchor of free trade, was beginning to lose its influence on the world stage. Other countries moved forward with trade agreements that excluded the US, including the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The message from international partners was clear: if America was going to pull back, they would move on without it. The World Trade Organization, which had long acted as a referee for global trade disputes, found itself under increasing pressure. The Trump administration questioned its legitimacy and blocked the appointment of new appellate judges, paralyzing the organization's dispute resolution function. As a result, countries became more inclined to settle matters bilaterally or seek alliances elsewhere, further eroding the structure of multilateral trade that had dominated for decades. Meanwhile, global supply chains began to fracture. For years, manufacturers had relied on China as the world's factory. The tariffs forced companies to reassess their sourcing strategies, not necessarily bringing production back to the United States, but shifting it to countries like Vietnam, India, and Malaysia. This fragmentation caused delays, cost increases, and new layers of complexity. It also signaled a shift toward a more regionalized, less efficient form of globalization. American companies scrambled to adjust. Some moved operations abroad to avoid tariffs. Others paid the tariffs and raised prices at home. Still others tried to re-engineer their products to qualify for different tariff classifications. The trade war didn't just change the price of goods. It changed the way goods were made, moved, and sold. Businesses spent time and money adapting to new realities, and the cost of that adaptation was often passed on to consumers. While Trump's administration eventually negotiated a Phase 1 deal with China in early 2020, the agreement was limited in scope. China committed to buying an additional $200 billion worth of American goods over 2 years, including agricultural products, energy, and services. But many analysts noted that the targets were unrealistic and compliance was weak. The deal did not roll back most tariffs, and it failed to address core issues like intellectual property protection and state subsidies for Chinese companies. The Brookings Institution reported that while some specific sectors saw temporary boosts, the overall effect of the trade war on US GDP was negative. It created economic friction at a time when global growth was already slowing. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the trade war reduced U.S. economic output by as much as 1/3 of a percentage point per year, with long-term consequences for productivity and investment. By the end of Trump's term, the trade war with China had not produced the sweeping victories that had been promised. Instead, it left behind a trail of disrupted businesses, alienated allies, and damaged relationships with key trading partners. The costs were measurable. The benefits remained mostly theoretical. And the strategic goal, forcing China to fundamentally change its economic model, was far from realized. In the next section, we will look at how these tariffs and trade disruptions helped fuel inflation, raised everyday consumer prices, and further strained American households already dealing with rising costs across the board. The trade war may have been fought on the global stage, but its consequences were felt in grocery stores, hardware aisles, and balance sheets across the United States. Inflation, consumer pain, and the hidden cost. Long before global headlines turned to pandemic-driven inflation, rising prices were already being felt by American households, and one of the least recognized culprits was tariffs. Though rarely framed as such in political speeches, tariffs functioned as hidden taxes that quietly raised the cost of living. When the Trump administration launched its broad tariff campaign, the impact on prices wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. Over time, the cumulative effect began to seep into every corner of the economy, from groceries to gasoline, from school supplies to smartphones. At first, the price increases were subtle. A few cents here, a few dollars there. But the real story unfolded slowly, as importers and retailers began recalculating their cost structures. With tariffs applied to hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods, companies had no choice but to reassess. While large corporations could delay price hikes or absorb some losses temporarily, the vast majority of businesses, especially small and mid-sized enterprises, couldn't afford to take the hit. And so, the extra cost made its way to the consumer, quietly adding pressure to household budgets. This silent inflation was especially difficult to track in real time because it was fragmented. Unlike a sudden fuel price spike or a visible change in interest rates, tariff-induced inflation was distributed unevenly across product categories. It didn't show up in dramatic headlines, but it showed up in the checkout line. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that the Trump tariffs contributed meaningfully to consumer price increases between 2018 and 2019, even before the world began grappling with the economic shocks of 2020. While the inflation wasn't explosive, it was persistent and difficult to reverse. Energy prices were also indirectly affected. Tariffs on industrial materials, including metals and components used in energy infrastructure, raised costs for utility providers and energy contractors. Over time, those increases filtered down to consumers through service fees, construction costs, and fuel expenses. The same pattern repeated itself in transportation, where tariffs on auto parts, tires, and machinery made vehicle maintenance more expensive. Families were spending more without realizing that much of the increase was a result of trade policies, not market forces. Retailers found themselves in a difficult position. For years, the retail model in the United States had been built around low-cost imports and razor-thin margins. Big box stores relied heavily on China and other low-cost manufacturing hubs to deliver affordable products to American shelves. When tariffs were imposed, those costs surged. According to a report from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, more than half of retailers surveyed during the trade war reported that they had no choice but to raise prices. The others tried holding out, hoping the tariffs would be lifted quickly. But as the trade war dragged on, those hopes faded, and so did their margins. Many small business owners were caught in an impossible situation. They lacked the scale to negotiate better deals with suppliers, and they didn't have the brand power to pass on higher prices without losing customers. A small toy manufacturer in Ohio, for example, reported that the cost of plastic components had jumped 15% due to tariffs on raw materials and imported parts. Unable to raise prices in a fiercely competitive market, the company was forced to cut back on production and delay expansion plans. Stories like these became common across the country. Entrepreneurs who had built lean, efficient operations on the promise of free trade suddenly found themselves paying the price for a geopolitical standoff they had no control over. The damage wasn't just financial, it was structural. Once a small business starts losing ground due to cost pressures, it becomes more vulnerable to automation, acquisition, or outright closure. Some business owners shifted to domestic suppliers, but the switch came at a premium. Others tried to find alternative markets, only to discover that the logistical and compliance costs of changing supply chains often outweighed the benefits. In the end, the tariffs created a fog of uncertainty that clouded decision-making, discouraged risk-taking, and reduced investment in long-term growth. Perhaps one of the most overlooked consequences of the tariff-driven inflation was its effect on economic inequality. The impact of rising prices is not evenly distributed. Lower-income households spend a larger percentage of their income on goods that were directly affected by tariffs. Essentials like food, clothing, electronics, and household goods became more expensive, eating into limited budgets. Wealthier households, with more diversified spending and access to financial tools, were better equipped to manage the shift. This disparity widened the economic gap. A Brookings Institution analysis emphasized that while tariffs were marketed as a form of economic patriotism, their real-world impact was regressive. Households earning under $50,000 a year were disproportionately affected by the price hikes, even as they were told the tariffs were working in their favor. The contradiction was stark. Those who were supposed to benefit from the policy were instead paying more for everyday survival. The ripple effects continued in schools, hospitals, and municipal budgets. Public institutions that relied on affordable materials for construction, maintenance, and equipment saw their costs rise. In some cases, projects were delayed or downsized. Public contracts became more expensive, and taxpayers absorbed the increase. Local governments, already stretched thin, faced higher procurement costs for basic infrastructure, everything from desks and chairs to roofing materials and HVAC systems. These were not abstract economic consequences. They were real, tangible setbacks in communities that had already endured decades of underinvestment. Even after the initial waves of tariffs had been implemented, the economic fog lingered. Businesses hesitated to make large purchases. Investors grew cautious. Consumer sentiment began to reflect the slow burn of uncertainty. The trade war may have started with a clear message about national strength, but its aftershocks told a story of quiet economic strain. By 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic introduced a new wave of inflation and supply chain disruption, the groundwork laid by the trade war made recovery even more difficult. Supply chains had already been reshuffled. Costs were already inflated. And consumer trust had already been shaken. In this sense, the tariff served as a kind of prelude to broader economic instability. The pain they caused didn't end with the trade war. It merged with other crises and continued to shape consumer behavior long after the headlines had faded. In the next section, we will explore how the political narrative around tariffs began to evolve as reality set in. We'll look at how supporters shifted their messaging from victory to sacrifice and examine whether the long-term gains they hoped for ever truly arrived. The slogans may have promised strength, but the outcomes revealed a very different kind of economic story. Changing narratives, from win to sacrifice. When Donald Trump first introduced tariffs as a cornerstone of his economic strategy, the message to the American people was direct and optimistic. This wasn't going to be a painful process, he said. It would be a win. A bold move to outmaneuver China, bring back manufacturing, and put America first. His supporters rallied behind him. Polls from early in the trade war showed that 46% of Republicans believed the tariffs would benefit the economy. The idea that the United States could finally outplay its global competitors resonated deeply with those who felt ignored by previous administrations and disillusioned by decades of globalization. At rallies, Trump repeated the claim that other countries, not Americans, would pay the price. He mocked those who doubted the strategy, portraying them as defenders of the status quo. In this narrative, the tariffs were not just a policy tool, they were a form of national redemption. Factories would reopen, steel would flow again, and America would no longer be laughed at on the global stage. It was a vision of economic justice wrapped in patriotic flair. But as the months wore on and prices began to rise, as farmers struggled to find export markets, and as retailers warned of higher costs, cracks began to show in the messaging. It became harder to ignore the growing body of data suggesting that the burden of the tariffs was falling squarely on U.S. businesses and consumers. Reports from the Federal Reserve, the Congressional Budget Office, and independent economists contradicted the original claims. The cost of imported goods was up. Manufacturing job growth had stalled. Trade deficits hadn't shrunk as promised. And key trading partners had responded with their own tariffs, targeting American industries in strategic states. Eventually, even Trump began to acknowledge what had once been unthinkable. In 2019, during a press conference, he stated plainly, "There will be some pain." This marked a turning point in the tariff narrative. The story was no longer about instant economic victory. It was about endurance. About sacrifice. Supporters began to shift their tone. Instead of claiming that tariffs would immediately help the economy, many argued that the pain they caused was a necessary step toward long-term gain. The logic became one of delayed gratification. Yes, things might be difficult now, they said, but the rewards would come. The country just needed to be patient. The phrase, short-term pain for long-term gain, began to appear in speeches, interviews, and conservative media outlets. The economic discomfort, supporters argued, was a sign that the policy was working. This interpretation reframed hardship as heroism. Consumers paying more were making a patriotic contribution. Farmers losing markets were enduring a battle for future stability. It was no longer about what was happening in the moment, it was about what might happen one day. But that shift in narrative didn't land the same way everywhere. In many parts of the country, especially in rural and working-class communities that had enthusiastically backed Trump, the promised benefits felt increasingly out of reach. Farmers who had lost their best customers were now reliant on federal subsidies. Small manufacturers who had hoped for protection found themselves squeezed by higher input costs. The gap between political promises and economic reality grew harder to bridge. Disillusionment began to creep in. Some longtime supporters of Trump's trade policies expressed frustration that the strategy seemed never-ending, with no clear victory in sight. Others grew tired of the shifting goalposts. What had started as a promise of immediate economic justice had become a vague call for sacrifice. Voter fatigue set in, especially in regions that had not seen the revival they were promised. While many remained loyal, the excitement had dimmed. The rhetoric still echoed, but the results were harder to see. Economists and policy analysts began to draw attention to the widening gap between political spin and economic data. Experts pointed out that tariffs were a blunt instrument, one rarely used with such scope in modern trade history. They argued that instead of fostering innovation or strengthening industry, the trade war had introduced uncertainty, raised costs, and weakened global confidence in U.S. trade leadership. Some even suggested that the long-term damage, broken supply chains, lost trust from allies, and slowed investment, would take years to fully understand. A report from the Brookings Institution highlighted the inconsistency in messaging. It noted that while the administration claimed tariffs were creating leverage, the data suggested otherwise. Manufacturing output had declined in key states. Employment in tariff-exposed sectors was flat or falling. And international partners were forging ahead with new trade agreements that excluded the United States altogether. Political commentators observed that the shift from winning to sacrificing marked a fundamental change in how economic hardship was communicated. For decades, American political leaders had tried to shield voters from pain, promising growth, prosperity, and security. But now, pain was being sold as a virtue. This marked a significant departure from traditional economic messaging. It turned the policy's failure to deliver results into a badge of honor, something to be endured rather than corrected. As this narrative shift took hold, the challenge for voters became deciphering which version of the truth to believe. Was the pain truly temporary? Was there a strategy beyond the hardship? Or was the sacrifice being used to cover up a flawed approach? These were not just theoretical questions. They affected how people voted, how they spent, and how they viewed the future of American economic policy. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at the actual outcomes. Did Trump's tariffs deliver on their core promises? Did manufacturing jobs return? Did the trade deficit shrink? And was the long-term benefit ever realized, or was the sacrifice in vain? The answers lie not in slogans, but in the numbers. And those numbers reveal the final layer of this story. Did it work? Measuring real outcomes. After years of economic upheaval, political battles, and promises of American revival, the time came to ask the central question of Trump's tariff strategy. Did it actually work? The answer, as laid out by the data and measured through economic performance, points to a conclusion that is difficult for supporters to reconcile with the original ambition. Despite sweeping promises to restore American manufacturing, reduce trade deficits, and re-establish dominance in global trade, the results were underwhelming at best, and in some areas, they were outright disappointing. One of the clearest indicators of whether the policy met its goals is manufacturing employment. Trump frequently cited the return of factory jobs as a key measure of success. But according to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, manufacturing employment saw only a modest uptick during his presidency, most of which occurred before the full weight of the trade war hit. After the tariffs took effect, manufacturing job growth stalled, and by the time the pandemic arrived in 2020, those gains had reversed. The hope of a full-fledged industrial comeback never materialized. The argument that tariffs would force companies to bring production back to US soil proved overly simplistic. In reality, most companies that left China did not return to the United States. Instead, they restructured their operations in other low-cost regions like Vietnam, India, and Eastern Europe. The global supply chain didn't collapse under the weight of Trump's policies, it simply rerouted itself around them. American firms continued to seek cost efficiency, and the tariffs did little to alter the fundamental economic calculus driving offshore manufacturing. Trade deficits offer another critical lens through which to evaluate the success of the strategy. Throughout the campaign and during his presidency, Trump repeatedly cited the trade deficit, especially with China, as evidence that America was losing. Tariffs, he claimed, would help balance the scales. But by the end of 2019, the U.S. trade deficit in goods was higher than when he took office. Even the deficit with China, which had briefly narrowed, widened again after initial tariff-driven shifts in purchasing behavior leveled out. The overall trade imbalance remained stubbornly persistent, suggesting that tariffs were not effective in addressing the underlying dynamics of global trade. In place of sweeping structural change, the Trump administration settled for incremental and largely symbolic trade deals. The renegotiated NAFTA agreement, now known as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, did include updates on digital trade and labor provisions, but economists widely agreed that its economic impact was marginal. It maintained most of the framework of the original NAFTA and did not fundamentally alter trade patterns among the three countries. The Phase 1 deal with China, hailed as a breakthrough, aimed to increase Chinese purchases of American goods, including agricultural products, energy, and services. But enforcement mechanisms were weak, and targets were missed. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, China fell far short of the agreed-upon benchmarks, and by 2021, analysts concluded that the deal had failed to deliver meaningful long-term results. While it may have provided temporary political relief, it did not resolve the structural issues Trump had initially targeted, such as forced technology transfers or intellectual property theft. Perhaps the most lasting consequence of the tariff policy was not economic, but diplomatic. Long-standing allies grew wary of American unpredictability. Nations that once relied on U.S. trade leadership began forging their own paths, pursuing new alliances and trade agreements that excluded the United States. The European Union accelerated trade deals with Japan and South American countries. The Asia-Pacific region moved forward with multilateral agreements without U.S. participation. The message was clear: global trade would continue, but not necessarily on America's terms. This loss of trust was not just about tariffs. It was about the perception that U.S. trade policy had become erratic and politically driven. Countries and corporations began to adapt to a world where America could no longer be counted on as a consistent partner. The global supply chain reconfigurations that took place during the trade war were not temporary. Many companies that moved operations out of China did not return, and they did not choose the US as their new base. They diversified in ways that made them less vulnerable to future American tariffs, further reducing US leverage in future trade negotiations. Ultimately, the numbers and outcomes tell a sobering story. Manufacturing did not return in any meaningful way. Trade deficits persisted. Temporary deals offered minimal relief but failed to achieve deeper structural reform. America's role in the global trade system was weakened, and trust among international partners was eroded. While the tariffs were intended as a bold, confrontational tactic, their long-term impact was far less about victory and more about fragmentation. In the final section, we will explore what economists and policymakers suggest could have been done differently. We'll look at the alternative strategies that might have delivered more effective results and ask the critical question: was there a better way forward? Because in hindsight, the cost of Trump's tariffs may have been not just economic, but strategic. And the window to rebuild global trust may now be narrower than ever. Alternative perspectives and what could have been done. While Trump's tariff strategy sparked intense debate and visible consequences, many economists and trade analysts argue that there was a more effective path forward, one that could have achieved similar goals with fewer economic costs. Rather than applying sweeping tariffs across entire industries and trading partners, experts have long advocated for a more surgical approach. Targeted tariffs, aimed at specific bad actors or narrow product categories, could have delivered pressure without destabilizing entire sectors. This strategy might have maintained leverage while minimizing the burden on consumers and small businesses. Beyond the scope of tariffs, one of the most glaring missed opportunities was the lack of investment in innovation and workforce retraining. The American manufacturing sector has been in decline not solely because of unfair trade, but also due to automation, changing technology, and global economic evolution. Instead of relying almost exclusively on protectionism, the administration could have paired trade enforcement with a bold domestic agenda, one focused on reskilling displaced workers, incentivizing high-tech manufacturing, and funding research and development that keeps America ahead of its competitors. Economists repeatedly warned that without such measures, tariffs alone would fall short. Looking abroad, countries like the European Union and Japan have taken a more nuanced approach to trade competition. Rather than turning inward, they reinforced multilateral trade agreements, streamlined supply chains, and invested heavily in digital infrastructure and sustainable industries. Their strategies emphasized adaptability and global integration, rather than isolation. This allowed them to remain competitive without triggering the kind of retaliation and uncertainty that the US trade war unleashed. Perhaps the most memorable critique came from a former US trade official who called tariffs a tax disguised as patriotism. The phrase stuck because it captured the emotional framing of the policy. Wrapped in nationalistic language, the tariffs were sold as a blow for American pride. But in practice, they became a financial burden borne mostly by the very people they were meant to protect. There was, and still is, room for a smarter trade policy. One that confronts unfair practices abroad while strengthening the economic foundation at home. But doing so requires more than tariffs. It requires vision, coordination, and the willingness to move beyond the slogans and into sustainable strategy. In the beginning, the promise was simple and bold. Trump's tariffs would bring back jobs, rebalance global trade, and make America economically stronger. They were introduced as a remedy for decades of decline, packaged as tough love for a country that had supposedly been losing on the world stage. But as the years unfolded and the effects rippled through the economy, the gap between rhetoric and reality became impossible to ignore. The true cost of tariffs wasn't just measured in dollars and cents. It was reflected in the 300,000 jobs that never returned, in the $5,000 per year that American families paid in higher prices, and in the deep erosion of trust between the United States and its trading partners. tariffs were marketed as an act of economic defiance. Instead, they became a slow-moving weight on the very people they were meant to uplift. The policies triggered inflation, disrupted supply chains, and fractured long-standing international relationships that had taken decades to build. Despite the pain, there is still no clear timeline for the long-term gains that were promised. Manufacturing has not come roaring back. Trade deficits remain stubborn. And while some sectors found temporary relief, most of the economy absorbed the damage without meaningful recovery. Even the Phase 1 deal with China failed to meet expectations. As the global economy continues to evolve, the US has been forced to watch as other nations rebuild alliances, sign new trade deals, and strengthen their positions while American policy remains reactive and uncertain. This moment demands a different kind of leadership, one rooted in transparency, strategy, and long-term thinking. It is no longer enough to wrap economic policies in slogans. The public deserves truth, clarity, and policies that produce tangible results rather than symbolic victories. The American economy is resilient, but it cannot thrive on promises alone. And so, the question remains, was it worth it? Were the tariffs a necessary shock to the system, or a costly detour that could have been avoided with smarter strategy? The numbers suggest one answer. The politics suggest another. But for millions of Americans still feeling the weight of higher prices and lost opportunities, that question isn't just academic.